Okay, in this video, we're looking at trade liberalization, looking at how it affects international competitiveness, domestic macroeconomic goals, and also living standards. So firstly, the definition of trade liberalization is the progressive removal or reduction of trade barriers to achieve free trade between sovereign nations. Now, you may have never seen the word sovereign nations, but it simply means a country that has its own power, and what that means is a country that has its own government. Like with any other type of trade, the only reason that we may make any type of compromise is if there are mutual benefits associated with a particular exchange. And so based off the definition, there should be some hints that removing these trade barriers is going to promote overall better living standards and allows Australia to achieve its macroeconomic goals. And so if there's hints of trade liberalization being such a positive thing, then we should be asking ourselves, why do trade barriers exist in the first place? And they can exist because of several reasons. The main one is that we try to protect our local industries, because if we continue to purchase all of our products overseas, then there's going to be a lack of business and a lack of production domestically, which is going to harm local producers and the country as a whole. And so common trade barriers are tariffs, which are taxes that we impose on imported or exported goods. And ultimately, it makes the price of a certain good or service more expensive, making it less attractive for people to purchase them. By doing so, that means that individuals are likely to buy the alternative, which is hopefully going to be domestic products instead. There are also quotas, which relates to the quantity restrictions for imported or exported goods into a country. And we can also use subsidies that are used as cash payments that help local producers make a certain good or service. There are also some political reasons as to why trade barriers may exist due to the recent COVID-19 accusations and back and forths that our country had with China. However, the main one we're focusing on is the first one, more specifically looking at tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. So some of the short-term benefits of trade barriers is obviously the protection of new industries, but also it provides job security and protection for nations that use these trade barriers. It also allows an offset of production costs between different nations. And what that means is, if we look at any other Asian country and we see that their costs of productions are lowered, then the government can step in and say, okay, we know that local production is expensive, so we're going to provide you guys some subsidies so that the costs are sort of leveled out and you're able to sell your product at a similar price. However, trade barriers have some negative impacts, and the main one is that there is a reduction for competition in local businesses, which means that there's a less incentive for them to be innovative and to lower costs and prices. And very closely linked is a lack of incentive for businesses to improve their efficiency or performance. And there's also a reduction in the efficiency of taxpayer money, especially if the government is providing a lot of subsidies for struggling domestic businesses. And once again, there are some political reasons as to why trade barriers may hurt our exporting industry. So the reason why we move to a more liberal type of trade is because we're able to achieve something called comparative advantage, and it's when we use our resources in the most efficient way that sacrifices the least amount of production. So in a simple example here, you can see that Australia can produce 1 kilo, or it should be 1 liter of wine using 2 resources, or it could produce 1 kilo of rice using 4 labor resources. Now if we compare that to Thailand, their production is identical. They could allocate 6 labor resources to the production of wine, or they could use 6 labor resources for the production of 1 kilo of rice. And so what you can see from this really simple example is that it's more efficient for Australia to be producing wine and for Thailand to be producing rice, because for Australia, we're able to use less resources for the production of wine, meaning that we could mass produce wine and allocate more of our labor resources and specialize in wine. Now for Thailand, it doesn't matter which one they produce, but if we're able to sell wine to them, then it's better off for them to only produce rice, and then we can exchange whatever's left over or not needed by the country itself. And so how do we achieve more liberal trade? We can essentially reverse all of those trade barriers that used to exist. And so what that means is we can remove the tariffs on imported products, we can abandon quotas, and the government can also remove its subsidies towards struggling businesses. The government can also create free trade agreements with other nations, and these agreements can be bilateral, meaning that it's exclusively between 2 countries, or it could be multilateral, which means that multiple countries are involved. And so the purpose of free trade agreements is that multiple countries can reduce the barriers to imports and exports amongst each other, making goods and services or even resources a lot cheaper to access. So let's look at how trade liberalization is going to affect the following three things. In terms of international competitiveness, since domestic businesses are facing higher levels of competition because now they're exposed to a lot more importing and exporting industries, they're forced to be more efficient with their resources. And if they're able to achieve greater levels of efficiency, it is going to place downward pressure on prices. Businesses will also be able to access cheaper inputs for production since their tariffs may be lowered, and that's ultimately going to help lower costs as well. And lastly, there's an improvement in resource allocation which helps achieve allocative efficiency. Building on comparative advantage, countries are now able to specialize in a single product instead of having to juggle all of their resources and making multiple products themselves. And so with the surplus of production, they're able to put that into the foreign market and exchange it for the goods and services that they desire instead. And so overall, domestically, consumers are exposed to a greater variety of goods and services, but also internationally, we are able to sell off more of our goods and services as well. And so ultimately, this helps achieve allocative efficiency because more people's needs and wants are being met. In terms of the macroeconomic goals, once again, businesses face cheaper imports that are used for production. And so what that means is that there's going to be a downward pressure on the prices, which can help achieve the goal of lower inflation. And if prices are lower, then it's going to also incentivize greater levels of spending, which we're going to see through the C and I component, which may help achieve economic growth if there's more production levels occurring in the economy. More liberal trade also helps boost production levels, once again helping achieve economic growth. And the export sectors have a greater ability to sell, and this ability is also enhanced through prices being lower, through lower costs of productions. There can also be a greater quantity of exports sold due to the removal of quotas. Now, liberal trade has a very mixed effect on unemployment, and you need to review the effect in a short-term perspective and also a long-term perspective. Now, in the short term, structural unemployment can increase because if domestic businesses are shutting down, due to them not being able to compete with international markets anymore, it will mean that there are certain skilled laborers that will not be utilized, and so unemployment increases. However, in the long run, from a theoretical perspective, these unemployed people will be reallocated into industries that Australia has a comparative advantage in. And so in the long run, the goal of full employment should be improved and sustained as certain industries will be able to achieve greater international competitiveness, which then increases the demand for these laborers. The last point relating to living standards, through improved efficiency, we're able to achieve greater net benefits as a whole, and this is because we have greater access to cheaper goods, greater quantities of specialized goods are available, and from a non-material perspective, there's a greater sense of security through international relationships as well. And so that concludes this video. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what trade liberalization means and how it is going to impact international competitiveness, our goals, and also living standards.